you are well. And I also hope that you had or is having a good day so far. All right, so for today, we will be doing our grade 6 English lesson on restrictive and non restrictive elements. So we'll be doing our lesson on restrictive and non restrictive elements, right? And before we start with our lesson on restrictive and non-restrictive elements, we're going to log in to aplusstudents.ca, and we're going to log in with our username as well as our password. We're going to select the subject of language arts, grade 6. All right, so the first lesson that we are going to be choosing is restrictive and non-restrictive elements. So our focus chapter is restrictive and non-restrictive elements, right? So if we go into our chapter, the lessons that we are going to be focusing on today is under the chapter restrictive and non-restrictive elements is what does the punctuation suggest, and commas with non-restrictive elements. So we are going to basically find out what restrictive elements is or are and what non-restrictive elements are, right? And our focus lessons under the chapter of restrictive and non-restrictive elements are what does the punctuation suggest and commas with non-restrictive elements. That is going to be our lessons for today. All right, so now we're going to start. All right, so we said that we are doing the chapter of restrictive and non-restrictive elements, and our focus lessons on are what does the punctuation suggest and commas with non-restrictive elements. All right, so restrictive elements, right, are word groups that are necessary to retain meaning. They are not set off by any commas, or they're not set off from the rest of the sentence by a comma or other punctuations, right? So this is restrictive elements, and restrictive elements are word groups that are necessary to retain meaning, right? And they are not set off from the rest of the sentence by either a comma or a punctuation. And examples of restrictive elements as well as non-restrictive elements, because we are now going to find out what the difference is between restrictive elements as well as non-restrictive elements, right? Restrictive elements are not set off by any commas. And then we have non-restrictive elements that are not essential to the meaning of its sentence, right? So now we're going to go deeper into what non-restrictive or restrictive elements are. So as much as we say that the restrictive elements are not set off by any commas, right? Restrictive elements, it is also known as essential elements, and they are phrases or clauses that are necessary to make the meaning of the sentence clear, right? So they are necessary to make the meaning clear of any sentence. And we say that these meanings or sentences that needs to be cleared or need to be made clear are not set off by any commas. So they don't need any commas or any form of punctuations in order to set them apart from the rest of the sentence. And restrictive words or phrases, they modify the noun or the pronoun, right? So they modify the noun or they modify the pronoun. All right, so also when it comes to restrictive elements, right, the reader must have this information to understand the sentence. So in order for you to understand the sentence, you need to know what it is about, or you need to understand the information, or you need to know the information in order to understand it. So when it comes to restrictive elements, right, we did say that a restrictive elements, it limits the meaning of the word that it alters. It is essential for understanding the sentence, therefore, it is not set off by any commas. And an example of a restrictive element, right, is food which is high in calories often tastes very good. So, food which is high in calories often tastes very good, right? So, when it comes to this sentence, right, as you can see that there is no commas even at all. So this sentence is not correct because if you were to write food, which is high in calories, often tastes very good, this would imply that all food often tastes good, right? So in this case, where it says food, which is high in calories often taste very good, it is specifying that the foods that are high in calories, they often taste good, right? It is not as implying that just all foods taste good, right? Because sometimes when we separate, let's say the word food, and then it means that we are first putting emphasis on food. Or sometimes if we comma or put the comma by next to calories or certain word, remember then it separates sometimes the specific words from the rest of the sentence, and then it means that you are just focusing on that specific word or phrase. Then we have non-restrictive elements, right? And non-restrictive elements are phrases or clauses that are not necessary to make a sentence clear. So restrictive elements, right? It needs to be made clear. The meaning needs to be clear, or the meaning of the sentence needs to be made clear. Whereas with non-restrictive elements, right, or phrases, non-restrictive elements, there are phrases or clauses that are not necessary to make any sentence clear. Non-restrictive elements are set off by commas, which means that you need to put commas or any forms of punctuation marks there. And non-restrictive elements are pieces of additional information that help clarify a noun or a pronoun, right? So with non-restrictive elements, right, it it is additional information that helps clarify a noun or pronoun, whereas with restrictive elements, it is words or phrases that modify a noun or a pronoun. So non-restrictive elements, right? It is also taking, it will not change the meaning or understanding of the sentence. So with non-restrictive elements, it will not change the meaning or the understanding of a sentence. And with restrictive elements, you must have the information to understand the sentence. So non-restrictive elements, right, is an element that describes or add additional information to the noun or pronoun whose meaning is already defined. So even though we know what the noun or the pronoun means, right, this is basically just added information or additional information to the noun or pronoun. It contains information that is not even essential to the main point of the sentence, and therefore a non-restrictive element is set off by a comma. So which means that sometimes the rest of the sentences, whatever they are adding, it doesn't even make sense because we've already gotten the point of what the noun or the pronoun defines. Example, ice cream, which is not included in my diet, is a food I try to avoid. So ice cream, which is not included in my diet, is a food I try to avoid. So even if we look at that sentence, right? Ice cream, comma, which is not included in my diet, comma, is a food I try to avoid. Sometimes we don't even have to add the middle sentence. If you look at the sentence, which is not included in my diet, you don't even need to add that sentence because you can just say ice cream is not in, is a food I try to avoid, right? If you try to avoid it, then we maybe know, okay, health wise, right? That is one of the reasons that he or she is avoiding it. But sometimes the added information, like which is not included in my diet, we don't even need to add those ones. All right, so let us go over to our tutorial page, right? And we're first going to go into the lesson that says, what does a punctuation suggest? So what does the punctuation suggest? And this is now based on the restrictive and non-restrictive elements. Okay, a restrictive element, and we're going back now. A restrictive element in a sentence, it is necessary in order for a reader to identify exactly who or what is being discussed. Right? So a restrictive element, it is in a sentence, is necessary in order for the reader to identify exactly who is being discussed or what is being discussed, right? And restrictive elements is not set off by commas. So any information when it comes to the restrictive elements, it is not set off by any commas. So if we look at the sentences, right? The teacher who is retiring is being honored with an award on Friday. So the teacher who is retiring is being honored with an award on Friday. So if we look at the underlined restrictive clause, right? That underlined restrictive clause, it helps the reader identify which teacher is being honored, right? So basically, it is telling us who is being discussed. So the teacher, it's not just any teacher that is being discussed, but the teacher who is retiring, we are talking about her. Because if you are in a school with a lot of teachers, right? If we were to just say the teachers being honored with an award on Friday, right, without any restrictive clause, we would have just mentioned, or you would have thought that it can just be any teacher. But if we, for example, say the teacher who is retiring is being honored with an award on Friday, now we specifically know that this is a teacher that is talking about the teacher who is retiring, right? Exactly who is being discussed. It is a teacher who is retiring. We are actually discussing her or him, right? Then we have another sentence, right? Basically similar to this one. As just said, the underlined words are removed. The teacher is being honored with an award on Friday. And in this case, without the restrictive clause, a reader doesn't know which teacher is being honored, right? So with the underlined words, right, there we can specifically see who is being discussed, right? Who is being honored with an award, right? Yeah, where we can say is the one who is retiring. So now we know Mrs. Is retiring, right? So if they are saying that the teacher is being awarded on Friday, then we know we are specifically talking about Mrs. Because she is the one who is retiring. So they are going to honor her with an award for her service, for her dedication, or for whatever reason, right? But if we don't add, for example, who is retiring, then it means that the reader doesn't even know which teacher is being honored. Now we also have we have non-restrictive elements. Non-restrictive elements. And a non-restrictive element, right? It provides information that is supplemental, right? It is not necessary in order for a reader to identify who or what is being discussed. So it is not necessary, right, in order for the reader to identify who or what is being discussed. So here with restrictive elements, right, it is important for the reader to identify who or what is being discussed. But with the non-restrictive elements, right, it is not important or it's not necessary in order for the reader to identify who or what is being discussed. So non-restrictive information is always set off with commas. And if we look at both and we compare both restrictive elements as well as non-restrictive elements, right? Restrictive elements, right, is a sentence, right, and it is necessary in order for the reader to identify who or what is exactly being discussed. Whereas non-restrictive elements, right, it's not necessary in order for the reader to identify who or what is being discussed. Restrictive elements is not set off with any commas, whereas non-restrictive elements, right, is always set off with commas. And that is now the difference between restrictive elements within sentences and non-restrictive elements. And now we're going to look at two examples of non-restrictive elements and also what it means or what it tells us. So with non-restrictive elements, an example is the Golden Gate Bridge, which first opened in 1937, took over 4 years to build. So the Golden Gate Bridge, and here we have a comma, which first opened in 1937, another comma, took over 4 years to build. And if we look at that sentence, right, the underlined information, which opened in 1937, right? This underlined information isn't even required to interpret the sentence, right? So it is not this information, it's added information which isn't required to interpret the sentence, which means that we can just say that the Golden Gate Bridge took over 4 years to build. That is with the non-restrictive elements. We don't even have to sometimes say that which first opened in 1937. Nope. That is added information. And with non-restrictive elements, they have added information which is not even necessary. So the Golden Gate Bridge took over 4 years to build. All of us know where the Golden Gate Bridge is. Not all of us, but I mean in the sense of if it were to be specific, then you would have known where the Golden Gate Bridge is because they are specifically stating the name of the bridge. So we know that the Golden Gate Bridge, it took over 4 years to build. No need for the added information which first opened in 1937. That is not even necessary, right? So the underlying information, it's not required or necessary to interpret the sentence because the Golden Gate Bridge took over 4 years to build is already straightforward. Then also, the Golden Gate Bridge took over 4 years to build. That is now without that underlined information, right? And without the information, the underlined information, the reader still knows which bridge took 4 years to build. Like if we talk about Disney World, right, that took over 4 years to build, we know Disney World, right? We still know what is being discussed. So we don't have to say Disney World, which first opened in 1995, took over 10 years to build, for example, right? So we can remove the which was first opened in 1995, and then we can just, for example, say that the um, Disney World took over so many years to build, right? The reader will still know what the information is or which, let's say, park was basically built. And that is now basically our differences between a restrictive element and a non-restrictive element. With a non-restrictive element, right, we don't need added information. So and added information is not necessary because we already know, like if we look at the underlined words, right? Without the added information, we still know what the reader is, what the writer or the person telling something is telling us about, right? When it comes to restrictive elements, right, sometimes the underlined words, right, it helps readers to identify who or what is being discussed. So without it, then we won't know who or what is being discussed. Whereas with the non-restrictive elements, it is totally different because without the added information, the reader will still know who or what is being discussed. So with the added information, it is basically just additional information that is basically not even necessary or is not even required to interpret the sentence. All right. So now we're going to go on to some sentences where we are going to identify if it is either a restrictive element or if it is non-restrictive element, right? All right. And we need to say, what does the punctuation suggest? So what does the following sentence suggest? White House reporters who have been cleared for the president's speech may enter the briefing room in 15 minutes, the press secretary announced. So, White House reporters who have been cleared for the president's speech may enter the briefing room in 15 minutes, the press secretary announced. So now we need to say, what does the following sentence suggest? That White House reporters who have been cleared for the president's speech may enter the briefing rooms in 15 minutes, right? And if we try to interpret what the sentence suggests, then it means that all White House reporters have been cleared. Which means that if you are already standing by the door, then you have been cleared to enter the room in 15 minutes' time. So all White House reporters have been cleared. Because remember, if you are already in the White House, then it means that you already have been cleared, right? So now it says who have been cleared for the president's speech is not set off by commas. So they didn't have to say, for example, the White House reporters, comma, right? Who have been cleared for the president's speech, comma, may enter the briefing room in 15 minutes' time. So in this case, it is not set off by any commas, which means that this is a restrictive element, right? So here they're saying that who have been cleared for the president's speech is not set off by commas. So it is restrictive and it narrows down the identity of White House reporters. So who is being discussed or what is being discussed? The White House reporters. We are discussing the White House reporters who have been cleared for the president's speech. So then they may enter the briefing room, right? And does it specifically mean that all White House reporters have been cleared? Nope. It only suggests that some of the White House reporters have been cleared. And that is why they say White House reporters who have. So the words who have been cleared, it gives you the indication that not every reporter that does, like the White House reporters, have been cleared. Only some of the White House reporters have been cleared. All right. What does the following suggest, right? The sentence suggests. Put the cherries that are bruised or soft in this container. So put the cherries that are bruised or soft in this container. Nina instructed her assistant in the kitchen. We can use them to make jam. So put the cherries that are bruised or soft in this container. Nina instructed her assistants in the kitchen. We can use them to make jam. We need to now say, what does the following sentence suggest? Right? So what does the sentence suggest? It tells us that put the cherries that are bruised or soft in this container. Nina instructed her assistant in the kitchen. We can use them to make jam. So which means that basically that all of the cherries that are bruised or soft, what should we do? We should put it in a container, right? So all of the cherries that are bruised or soft should be put in a container because jam is going to be made of that, right? So if we look at specifically at that sentence again, right? That are bruised or soft, right? If we look at that are bruised or soft, it is not set off by any commas, which means that this is a restrictive element, right? So this is a restrictive element. And with the restrictive element, it identifies or it already narrows down the identity of the cherries, right? So put the cherries that are bruised in the container. So which cherries? The ones that are bruised or soft. That is being discussed. What is being discussed? We are talking about the cherries, and which cherries? The ones that are specifically bruised or soft. But it is not set off by any commas, which means that this is a restrictive element, right? We already know the identity of the cherries. It is the ones that are bruised or soft. So only the ones that are bruised or soft needs to be put in the container because those ones are going to be used to make jam. The fresh ones will probably be eaten, for example, which they're not discussing. But in this case, we already know what is being discussed, which is the cherries. But which type of cherries is being discussed? We are talking about the ones that are bruised or soft. What should we do with the ones that are bruised or soft? We should put it in a container because jam is going to be made of it. So we are discussing the cherries that are bruised or soft. And only some of the cherries, not all of it. Miss Burton bought her pet chinchilla. So Miss Burton bought her pet chinchilla Chichi 3 years ago from a breeder in Denver, Colorado. So Miss Burton bought her pet chinchilla Chichi 3 years ago from a breeder in Denver, Colorado. So if we look at our sentence is what does the following suggest? So this suggests that Miss Burton, right, has a pet named Chinchilla Chichi, right, which she bought 3 years ago, right? So they're not necessarily saying that she only has one pet, but if we do look at the information, then it gives us the information that she only has this one pet, which is Chinchilla Chichi, right? So now, if we look at that sentence, right, it is a restrictive element. And what gives us the idea that it's a restrictive element, right? Chichi is not set off by commas because now Chichi is an added, right? So Miss Burton bought her pet chinchilla Chichi 3 years ago from a breeder in Denver, Colorado. And this is restrictive and it narrows down the identity of her pet. So instead of saying Mrs. Burton bought a pet, comma, chinchilla, they are just saying that she bought a pet chinchilla. So we already know what is being discussed. right? Who the identity is or what the identity is of, let's say, the pet. So Mrs. Burton bought her pet, and the name of the pet is Chinchilla Chichi. So which means that the sentence suggests that Miss Burton has more than one pet. And what gives us the idea that it has more than one pet? Because she's specifically making mention of the name of the pet. Because if she just said that she bought her pet, then we would have gotten the idea that she maybe only has one pet. But if she now specifically saying that she bought her pet, Chinchilla, right, then it means that she has more than one pet, and we're specifically talking about this pet, Chichi, that she bought 3 years ago from a breeder in Denver. All right. So if we now look at, so that is basically restrictive and non-restrictive elements, right? Where with restrictive elements, it is a sentence that is necessary in order for a reader to identify exactly who or what is being discussed, and is not set off by any commas. And a non-restrictive element, it provides information that is supplementary, which is not necessary in order for a reader to identify who or what is being discussed. Usually when it comes to the non-restrictive elements, it is straightforward that we will be able to see who or what is being discussed, or who or the reader, or who or what the reader identifies that is being discussed, right? And with non-restrictive elements, it is always set off by commas. Whether there is added information that is not necessary, it is still set off with commas. All right, so now we're going to begin our test. What does the following sentence suggest? We need to say what the sentence suggests. Visit Mrs. Walton's shop, Home Goods Central, for everything from basic hardware supplies to more unusual items, such as vintage farm equipments, used sewing machines, and hand constructed wheelbarrows. So visit Mrs. Walton's shop, Home Goods Central, for everything from basic hardware supplies to more unusual items such as vintage farm equipment, used sewing machines, and hand constructed wheelbarrows. So, if we look at this type of sentence, right, this is non restrictive, right? And it is set off by commas. So, now we need to say, what does the following sentence suggest? Does it suggest that Mrs. Walton has other shops besides Home Goods Central? Or Mrs. Walton's only shop is Home Goods Central? All right, and if we look specifically at the commas that is in there, right? It says visit Mrs. Walton's shop, Home Goods Central, right? Which means that she has other shops besides Home Goods Central. Otherwise, she would have just said visit Mrs. Walton's shop for everything basic hardware. So in this case, especially where she adds the Home Goods Central, right? It gives us the idea that she has other shops besides Home Goods Central. Oh, in this case, it says Mrs. Walton's only shop is Home Goods Central. So in this case, right, if we have a sentence where we are, making a little mistake, right, these things do happen where we make a mistake because it can be very confusing, right? But whenever you get something wrong, what you can do is you can go to where the correct answer is, copy the link, send it to us, and then you will be able to get 100. You will get 100 points, right? So in this case, it basically shows that Mrs. Walton shop, Home Goods Central, is the only shop in the only shop is Home Goods Central, right? So we got that. The concert attendees who ordered tickets in advance may enter the arena as early as 4 p.m. So the concert attendees who ordered tickets in advance may enter the arena as early as 4 p.m. So what does the following suggest? Does it suggest that some concert attendees did not order tickets in advance, or all concert attendees ordered tickets in advance? It says the concert attendees who ordered tickets in advance, tickets in advance, may enter the arena as early as 4 p.m. So this gives us an idea that some concert attendees did not order tickets in advance, right? Which means that they will probably order tickets or buy tickets by the gate or something like that, right? But not all concert attendees ordered tickets in advance. So the concert attendees who ordered tickets in advance may enter the arena as early as 4 p.m. So that is only for people who ordered tickets in advance. They may enter 4 p.m. So that means that some concert attendees did not order tickets in advance. All right. Every Labor Day, Mika and her family host an elaborative barbecue for the neighbors who stay in town. Mika and her family host all of the neighbors. Mika and her family host some of the neighbors. If we look at this sentence, right, what do you think this sentence suggests? It says every Labor Day, Mika and her family host an elaborative barbecue for the neighbors, right, who stays in town. Mika and her family, they host all of the neighbors. Mika and her family host some of the neighbors. So, what does the sentence suggest? Do you think the sentence suggests that Mika and her family host all of their neighbors? Or does it suggest that Mika and her family host some of the neighbors? So, what do you think? What does the following sentence suggest? That every Labor Day, Mika and her family host an elaborative barbecue for the neighbors who stay in town. Mika and her family host all of the neighbors, or Mika and her family host some of their neighbors. So, what does this suggest? Does the sentence suggest that Mika and her family host all of the neighbors? Or does it suggest that Mika and her family host some of their neighbors whenever they host an elaborative barbecue for the neighbors? All right, so if we look at the sentence, right, it says, what does the following suggest? Mika and her family either host all of the neighbors, or Mika and her family host some of the neighbors, right? If they are living in town, right? Or they're specifically saying that Mika and her family host an elaborate barbecue for neighbors who stay in town, right? Does it mean that she's hosting all of the neighbors, or does it suggest that she is hosting only some of the neighbors, right? Remember, whenever somebody maybe hosts a barbecue, then only some of the neighbors are invited, right? Not even invited. Let's say they basically come, right? Because not everybody is keen on being invited to, let's say, a barbecue. So we can maybe say that she invites some of her neighbors. for the neighbors who stay in town. So we can either say can be all of the neighbors, or in this case, it can be some of the neighbors. So in this case, it says all of the neighbors, right? So as much as it is all of the neighbors, remember only some of the neighbors, they come to these barbecue, elaborative barbecues. But in this case, right, if you get something incorrect, you can go and look for the correct answer, copy the link, send it to us, and then you can get 100 bonus points, right? Because it can be very tricky. But in this case, Mika and her family invites all of their neighbors. All right. So now, before we end off, we're going to commerce with non-restrictive elements, right? Remember, we said that non-restrictive elements, it always needs to have a comma, right? Whereas with restrictive elements, it is not set off by any commas, right? So with non-restrictive elements, we use commas to set off non-restrictive information within a sentence. And non-restrictive information is supplemental, right? It is not necessary in order for a reader to identify who or what is being discussed. Because with it, whenever it comes to non-restrictive elements, it already, without the added information, we already know that this or who or what is being discussed. So sometimes with non-restrictive elements, right, there's added information which is not even necessary. That is not even added information that will add on to the identity of who or what is being discussed. And without the information, the meaning of the sentence would still be clear. Meaning, whatever you add on, right? All of the added informations with all of the commas, right? The information would still be clear without that, right? And we made an example of the Golden Bridge Gate, and then we underlined which first opened in 1937, took over 4 years to build. So, meaning that the underlined information is basically just added information, right? It is not even necessary at all. Because if we remove that underlined information, and then our information will still make sense, our sentence would still make sense, and we will still know who or what is being discussed. So we do not use commas to set off restrictive information in a sentence. So we do not use commas to set off restrictive information, only non-restrictive information. That is why we say the restrictive elements, right? It is not set off by any commas. It is not set off by any commas. Restricted information, it is necessary in order for the reader to identify exactly who or what is being discussed. And without the information, the meaning of the sentence would become unclear. So we need a bit of added information. It's the example that we made of the teacher that is retiring, right? So the added information about the teacher who is retiring told us who or what is being discussed. And without that, it wouldn't have been clear. The same with this one. The author J.K. Rowling was born in Yate, England, right? So if we look at the underlying information, the underlying information helps a reader to identify which author is being discussed. So instead of just saying the author was born in Yate, England, right, we now know that J.K. Rowling was born in Yate, England, right? And if we had to remove that information, then without that information, we wouldn't have known who or what is being discussed or which author is being discussed. So sometimes the added information, it is necessary. All right, so that is basically now our lesson on restrictive and non-restrictive information, and we said when it comes to restrictive and non-restrictive information, restrictive elements are not set off by any commas, right? It is necessary for readers to understand exactly who is being discussed or what is being discussed, right? And without certain information, the meaning of sentences would not be unclear, right? Because we need to know exactly the identity of who or what is being discussed. Whereas with non restrictive elements, right, we do not use commas to set off non restrictive information within sentences. Non-restrictive information, it is only supplemental, and it is not necessary in order for the readers to identify who or what is being discussed, right? So sometimes without the information, which is the added information, the meaning of the sentence would still be clear. And when it comes to non-restrictive information or elements, there's always additional information, but without that additional information, the meaning of the sentence would still be clear. All right, so grade sixes, that is now the end of our lesson on restrictive and non restrictive elements. You should have an amazing day further. Till next time, goodbye.